Hey everybody, welcome back to DJ Tutorials, and today we are going to be looking at doing fire and smoke materials using LuxCore Render. Now, if you are unfamiliar with LuxCore, you can download it from the LuxCore website. The link will be in the video description down below. However, what you'll need to do if you're using the more recent builds of Blender, which I'm using 3.0.1, I believe, you're going to need to go to this location here, which I'm going to have the link down below in the video description. It's the GitHub location, and you're going to want to get the latest build that's available because this will actually work with the newest builds of Blender, and you can pick whichever one down in here for the operating system that you're using. And for this particular project, what we're going to be doing is using the fireball simulation that I showed everybody how to make in my fireball, smoke, and fire simulations project. So you can follow that tutorial series up until the point where you do the materials, then you can switch over to LuxCore and we can start to do the LuxCore materials in there. So you can feel free to do that. I believe I also have a download of this file on my Gumroad, which the link is down below as well, so you can download that too if you don't want to do all the work here. So to begin with, what you can see right here is this is basically the end of the project that we did for the fireball simulation. So it's pretty cool. And I'm just going to grab the volume that's right here. We're not going to do the sparks for this because we're just going to be doing the smoke and the fire materials for this project. We're just going to grab this. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to open up a new build or a new session of Blender. You can see right here I'm using 3.0.1 and we can hit A to grab all this stuff, delete it, and Control V to paste that in here. So there's our simulation right in there, and because the noise is pretty high resolution here, I'm just going to turn that off, and I'm going to hit play here so you can see what the simulation looks like. So it's pretty cool looking. It just goes like that, and we're going to make this look really, really, really cool. So go ahead and get your file set up to where all you're basically looking at is your simulation with your fire and smoke, and we can get started. Okay, so for us to get started doing these materials, what we're going to do is go over to our render properties here and switch this over to LuxCore. And again, if you are not familiar with LuxCore, what you might want to do is check my YouTube channel. I have a whole bunch of LuxCore stuff on there, like how to download it and install it and the basics of how it works. Just make sure that if you're using this build of Blender, which is 3.0 or higher, that you're using the most recent development build. Otherwise, most likely, it will not work. So let's change this over to LuxCore. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to change a couple of these settings over here. From here, we're going to change this to GPU for the device because I want to use my GPU for this. And what you might want to do also, if you go into your Blender preferences and you type in LuxCore and you click this little down arrow, you'll see the GPU API. If you're using an NVIDIA card, you'll want to make sure that you're on CUDA. And if you're using an OpenCL card like a AMD card, or I guess there's new Intel cards and stuff like that that might be using the OpenCL API, you'll want to make sure that you're selected on the right one. If you're using Mac, I believe you're using Metal for that, unless you're using an eGPU, in which case you might have CUDA settings, but most likely you're using Metal for that. And you can see here I'm using version 2.61, and let's close that out. So over here with light paths, this is going to work just fine. We don't need light tracing for this. However, you could try and do that if you'd like. And one thing that I will say right now when it comes to the fireball simulation here is that the one that I created really is high resolution. There are a lot of details that are in this fireball simulation once you turn on the noise setting, and it will change how the materials function, and you'll see more about what I'm talking about when we get to that. But I just want to let you know ahead of time, you'll want to do a lot of your stuff just using this without the noise selected. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very slow for you. The other thing that you'll want to do here is go down to the viewport render right here and change this to your GPU. If it is your first time using this engine, you will have a little bit of a problem because it needs some time to build basically the rendering stuff inside of your system. So just give it some time. Sometimes it takes 10 to 15 minutes. Just let it do its thing, and then you'll be able to continue with the rendered setting. The other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to turn off the denoiser because that does take some time to do that and it will slow down your rendering. So let's go ahead and remove that. We don't need to really do anything with the advanced settings here. And we're pretty much ready to go. The other thing that we're going to do, and I'm going to go ahead and change this to the rendered view here. You can see that it's just a box because we have no materials. If you go here, you can see that it's smoke domain material from my session when it was a cycles one or a cycles project. I don't have this checked and I don't think it even works. And we're going to be using LuxCore anyway. But you can see that I have a sort of like an azimuth sky background here. And that's just the standard that's used for the world settings here. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this where it says gain right here. And we're going to take that down to a 0 because we're not going to use a background. We're just going to have this be our fireball simulation. We will add some lights in as we do this materials or as we do the materials. But for now, we're just going to have no lighting in the scene because we have fire, which will have the lighting for us. So let's go back to the solid mode, and we're just going to split the panel here. You could go to your shading tab. I'm just used to doing it this way. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to collapse this right down here because we really don't need a timeline at the moment because we're just going to focus on this frame right here because it looks pretty cool. So let's change this up here to the LuxCore material nodes. You don't want to use the shader editor because in LuxCore, you want to make sure that you're using this one right here. And let's collapse this panel here. And there's nothing there because we don't actually have any materials yet on this object. So if you want to add a material, go here. It says materials properties. And if you click this little down arrow, you'll see a whole bunch of presets that are already here. And you'll see right here, there's one called fire and smoke. So you could do colored smoke, but we have fire and smoke, so we're going to click on this one right here. When we zoom in, you can see that there's this stuff right here. There's some advanced material settings and all that. We have a null material, which is going to make some things transparent. But you can see here, at least for the outside of this box here, you can see right here we have an interior volume. Now, I will tell you that when we start to go into this, it does get a little bit nested, and you could just copy and paste the volume settings out of this nested volume material and place it right in here, and it will do the same thing. But we're just going to use this and just get used to this sort of like flow here. So we're going to click this show button right here. And you can see up here it changed to this little drop shape. And if you click this, you'll see there's LuxCore material nodes and LuxCore volume nodes. And if you go between the two, you'll see right here, here's the material with the null material on the top there. And then if we click the little drop, it looks like there's nothing there. Go right here and you'll see that we have fire and smoke volume, and that is where it is living. Okay. So if we sort of like separate these a little bit, and you'll have to sort of forgive how some of the noodles are here. The connections are a little bit wonky right in here, but it is what it is. And if we go over here and we just look at this in the rendered view, you'll see that you automatically have a fireball material. Done, right? Tutorial over. Okay, yeah, you could do that. That's fine. The thing here, though, is that you might want to adjust some of these properties or add some sort of custom material to this whole project. So we're going to do a little bit more work here than just simply doing that. So you've probably noticed now on the bottom left, you could see a keyboard and a little mouse. So you can see the button commands that I'm going to be doing from now. So you can sort of follow along if you get lost as to what I'm clicking on. But really, since we're not doing a whole bunch of modeling or anything like that, we're really not doing a whole lot of shortcuts or anything. It should be pretty obvious what I'm doing, mostly left clicking things and all that. But anyway, it's down there just in case you need it. So what we have here is we have a smoke domain node, which if you look right here, you can select the domain in case you have different domains here. And you'll see right here it says precision. And you can see it says half, float, or byte. Now, if you kind of take a look at this here, and if we're looking at our rendering on the left side here, and let's change this up here. Let's turn off our overlays by clicking this right here so we just see this rendered view. Hit N. Oh, let's actually hit T there to hide that. You can see that there we have our fireball, right? And if you take this precision and you change it to byte, for example, and let's just reset our viewer just in case, you can see that not really a whole lot changes. And if we change this to a float precision, you can then change, just in case if you don't see anything that changes and you should see a change, you can reset your viewer here by going to solid then back to rendered, you see there's really not a whole lot that's changed here. And it's very likely that you won't see that. But once you start adding some sort of like complexity to the math that's being calculated with this data here, you will sometimes start to see a difference. So with what this basically does here is you can kind of like float over it and it will tell you only 1 byte per value requires memory half of half and 1/4 of float. Basically, the byte is the lowest sort of like data needed to have this be rendered out. And since this is pretty, you know, similar to the other settings, and you were just going to render it straight out of here, you might want to just leave it to that because it might let everything be a lot faster with loading and it might use less memory and stuff like that. But if you use the half and the float, it's going to use more information to sort of like push the calculations through this object. Okay. And the other thing here is if we look at the heterogeneous volume, we have a multi-scattering, which if we click that on, you can see that it does take longer to render, but you could see that this smoke now has gotten brighter because it's actually doing more than just one effect to reflect that light there. So you get a much more realistic render of your smoke just by turning that on or off. You can see there it's a lot darker. Turn it on, and it has just more scattering going on, but it does take longer. So you have to kind of think about that when you're going to do these renders. Okay. We're just going to turn it off for now just to make this faster to update. The other thing here is an absorption depth, which it's, as it says here, depth at which white light is turned into the absorption color, which doesn't really matter until you change this absorption color here, which we're not going to do too much with right now. You could just change this to a red or whatever, and you can see that it does change the overall color. So you can start to play with that. But for this particular tutorial, we're going to do some advanced stuff, but we're not going to do too much into this absorption color here, okay? And of course, IOR, you can see right here, index of refraction, 1.0 is air, which we're going to leave, and then there's water and glass. So we're just going to leave it as that for now. And then there's scattering scale, which if we change this to a 50, for example, you'll see that that smoke got a lot more dense. And to show this a little bit more clearly, what I'm going to do is go into a solid mode here, turn back on my overlay, Shift A to add. We're going to add a point light, and we're just going to grab this and put it right over here behind the smoke, kind of like that right there. And then in the lighting setting right here, I'm going to change this gain to like, I don't know, 150. And let's look at the rendered view here. So you can see that light is hitting the back of the smoke there. Let's change this to a 350. And that's just a little bit more obvious. So if you look at that and watch as I change the scattering scale to a 1, and because we don't have this actually selected, you'll see that now it's a lot more thin, the smoke here. If you select your object that you're changing here, it will actually update a little bit better, I've noticed. So see, scattering scale is at a 1, change it to a 10, and it just updated, so now it's a little bit more thick, okay? And we could change this to a 50 or 100 or whatever it is, and you get a lot more of a thick smoke effect, just like that. Let's go ahead and save our file here, and I'm going to change this to a solid mode, save as, and I'm going to call it lxfire1, and I'm going to do underscore toot, because it's the tutorial that I'm doing. So you may be going, okay, cool. That seems pretty simple. You have your, all this stuff set up here. I did a couple changes. Of course, there's this asymmetry, which again, we're not really going to get too much into right here. It just basically changes the coloring effect of the overall smoke and everything. But you may be wondering, okay, so, what else can I do here? How can I adjust our smoke effect and our fire effect here? So how we do that is through math nodes. And you can see here that they've already created a multiply right here for the emission right here. And if we go back to the rendered view, let's go ahead and turn off the overlays. And you can see here's the fire right here. You'll see it looks a little voxely. That's because it's not set to the higher resolution with the noise. But if we change this to like, let's say a 10, you can see that it multiplies that color and we get a brighter fire effect, all right? And if we change this to a 0.2 or something like that, it's going to make it less bright. Let's change this back to a 1. And what we're going to want to do here is take some of these data points, and we're going to use some of this math to change how our color ramp is working here for the fire effect, and to change how the emission or the scattering is being calculated right here. So for now, let's just focus on the smoke. So we're going to change this to a 0, which will then, you can see here that it basically turned off our fire effect, and all we're seeing is the smoke. And to make it a little bit more clear what's happening with the smoke on the other side, let's hit Shift D on this light, pull it to the other side. And I'm actually going to change the color of this light to, let's do a little bit of a blue color, and go back to the rendered view. And you can see now we have the front facing, which is a blue color. And then we have the back facing light, which right there shows a white color. So we can kind of see the back side and the front side a little bit easier. And you can notice right here, there's a whole lot of smoke right in the front where the fire is. And as it goes through to the end, to the tail of the smoke effect over there, you can see that it gets less and less dense. And what we need to do here, if we want to control more of how this is sort of being calculated, we want to take some of the smoke information and the fire information and use it to basically calculate where the density is going to be placed. Because I like in my fireball settings where in the head of the fire there's less smoke because there's less calculations needed, and it kind of lets the fire like sort of breathe a bit as far as the overall coloring and the visibility of it. And then it kind of like gets thicker as it goes towards the end here. So basically what we can do is we can hit either Shift A to add, or we can just hit Shift D while we click on this multiply here, move it up here. Keep it set to, actually, we're not going to keep it set to multiply. We're going to change this to a subtract, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to subtract the flame from the density of the smoke that's going on here. And we're going to take that and we're going to put that right in the, actually, let's disconnect this first and put this right there. And I'm going to change the scattering to a 10 for the scattering scale. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to multiply this value. So if we hit Shift D here, move it right there, multiply, and then we can change this value here. And if you don't see anything updating, you might need to reset the viewer by going to solid, then back to rendered. And you can see right here, there's less smoke in the head of that fireball. Let's change the scattering scale to a 1 so it's a little bit more clear. And let's actually make sure we're selected on our object. You can see there it wasn't selected. So go back to the rendered view, and you can see there that now if we change this multiply to, let's say, a 50, it should update. There we go. It's more thick here. And then at the head of the fireball, you can see it's less visible. And if we take the scattering scale here, which basically multiplies everything, and set it to a 50, you're adding back in smoke to the overall effect. But you can see that it's a little bit dissipated right here at the head of the fireball. So let's change this value and let's go crazy and make it to like a 500 or something. And you can see that you can start to get some super dense, super dense stuff. But then this scattering scale starts to kind of like, multiply it back over the top, and then you end up getting that back. So let's change this back to a 1. And now you can see it's a little bit more clear that there's less smoke at the head of this. Let's change this back to something a little bit more manageable, like a 25 or something. Something like that. Pretty neat how you can change the effects here. Now, you can feel free to take some of these and pipe them in, try subtracting, heat or temperature, and try using power. So if you go here to power instead of multiply, let's change this to a 1. You can see there is that right there. And if we change this to a 2, you can see how that's happening there. And if you change it to like a 0.25 or something, you get kind of a different sort of mathematical equation to see how that's working. But I really think that the multiply is what tends to work a bit better than anything else as far as making this effect. But I do recommend that you play with this and try and find something that you really like. Now, let's try and change this to byte now instead of float and see what happens. You can see that there was a little bit of a change in how this was being calculated. Right, and here you can see it the most. So if we look right here, change it to byte, you can see that now that's gone. So Now that we've started to take this information and multiply it against each other and everything else, especially once we add back in that the noise to see the really detailed smoke that's happening here, you will notice that there is quite a bit of a difference when you change this from float to byte and to half. And just so that you know, basically this is just what your computer can handle. If float is way too slow for you, you might need to use byte in order to get this going together or to get it done in a reasonable amount of time. It's really just up to what your computer can handle at this point. Now, taking that same idea, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to take this multiply and we're going to put this, actually, let's take the scattering scale and let's make this a 0, okay? Just so that we can keep that, there, or keep this node set at what we liked. And then this right here, the color ramp, we're going to start to mess with this stuff here. And then when we're done with that, we just want to add the scattering scale back to a 1, okay? Just some organizational stuff for you guys. So what we'll do here is taking the same idea. What we're going to want to do is calculate some of this stuff together to then create just a little bit more either detail or control in how our flame is being calculated. So let's set this multiply back to a 1. And there's our fireball right there. And let's actually turn this off. Hopefully we'll just keep selected on that. We won't have any more issues, but let's just keep it like that. And we're going to duplicate this multiply here. And I'm just going to put it right here. Be careful not to just set it right in the noodle because it will sort of take over and we might not want to use that. So let's use this to then take the flame and the temperature and we're going to multiply those two together. And let's just put that right in here. And you can see that there really wasn't much of a difference there. Okay. And we can try to reset these and see if there was a difference. There you go. So it looks like maybe I deselected. Nope, it just didn't update because when I added the node, it just didn't update. So now you can see we have a difference in how the fireball is being calculated. Hopefully you guys can see that. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this multiply, and we're actually going to put it right here in between these two nodes. And you can just drop it right there in the noodle and it will go in there. And we can change this value to like a 0.2 or something. And you can see now we are changing the values that are being calculated to go into this color ramp. And if we change this to like a 0.45 or something like this, you can see that we have more control over the really bright areas that are the white color here and the more yellowish or the more flamey bits that are down in this area here. Then with this multiply node at the very end, we can then control how bright the overall effect is from this color ramp here going into our emission. So if we change this to a 0.2, for example, it will take that down to about there. If you change it to a 10, for example, it can bring it up to that bright, just like that. So if we take this value here, for example, and we make it a 0.1, you can see that it gets overall a lot less bright. But then at the very end here, we can pop this to a 50, which will change the overall brightness. So you can control the areas of your fire to make it less or more bright. So just an example here. Before, we just had the flame going directly into this color ramp. And if I reset this here like that, you can see that it's just like this and that the multiply at the end set to a 1, it just looks like this. So you have a bright point right here. And if you set this multiply to a 10 or something, you can change the overall brightness, but you really don't get that other bit of control. And if we take this now and pop it into here, reset our viewer, we now have a little bit more control over which areas are brighter, which areas are not. And at the end of this whole chain, we can then control the amount of brightness there. So it's just a way for you to add some more versatility in your fire effect. So another thing that you can do, let's just select this again, and we'll go to a little bit different view here. Another thing that you can do just to play around with these ideas, and I'll show you one cool thing that you can do. Let's duplicate this multiply node and put it down here. And we're going to change this to a subtract. And let's take the flame and we're going to subtract it from the density like this. And then let's duplicate the multiply like this here. Put that just into the top right here. We're going to go to solid view on the viewer because sometimes the nodes don't update properly. and plug that multiply right back into this color ramp here. So we have this one up here, and then we have this right here. And let's see what this looks like. And there you can see that now we're starting to get a little bit different of an effect. We have a cooler section right here and a hotter section right here. And if we change this multiply to a 0.5, for example, we can pop that up a little bit more. And we can take this, change this to a 1, and you can see that it's a little bit of a darker effect here. Change this to a 10, and it's a brighter effect like that. So you can have a lot of different effects by basically taking these different parts of your smoke material and multiplying them or subtracting them or even adding them together to get some different effects. So for example, you can basically add another node. If I duplicate this here, change this to add, you can then pipe this and this together and put it into your color ramp. Or you can multiply these by each other as well to get a different effect. So you can play around with these a lot and you can get some really cool effects. Now, you can notice that the sort of like tail here seems to have no fire at all. And that's, that's just how it is right now. But you can add some of that fire back in. And how we do that is basically we can take, let's just duplicate this multiply here, and you can take the density, which is just the density of the overall smoke effect, right? Take that and just pipe that right into your color ramp. And let's see what that looks like. So you can see we have the whole fireball trail that's going on here. And let's say you multiply this and it's set to a 0.5 right there. So it is set to a 1 for the multiply. Let's just say that, you want like a 0.25, right? So what you can do basically from this point here, if you want to see this and something else mixed together, you can actually duplicate, so Shift D to duplicate this guy, change this from multiply to a mix node, okay? So we have two different values here. Put this bottom set right here, this multiply, put that into the bottom, take this top one right here, put it into the top, and then put that into here. And let's just reset our viewer. And basically what you have here, if we go to 0, you can see that there's the 1 effect right here. So this is value 1. And if we change to a 1 here, you can see that that's value 2, or the bottom. And we can change this to like a 0.75 or something like that, or even a 0.65 if you want just a little bit that's visible, maybe a 0.7. You can see that now we have that little trail effect there with the little fire, and you have this top one right here, which is pretty neat that you can sort of mix those things together and create some different effects. So we can take this here even and reset this in case we have to do that. And now you can see that there's a different effect that happens overall. Now, another really cool thing is you can actually use these to make even more complex fire shapes. So for example, if we change this to a subtract, okay, which is going to change this overall, but let's take this one here and put this into the top. And let's reset this viewer here. Check that out. Look how cool that is. You get this really neat little puffy effect at the back, and you can start to see some of the shaping in the front end of that fireball shape. And then we could take this here and pop this up to maybe a 50 or something. You can see that now we have more of this like weird sort of like effect going on. Now I'm going to save this, and I don't recommend that you guys do what I'm going to do right now because it might, make your computer go really slow. But I'm going to change this to the noise. I'm going to turn the noise on for our fluid smoke domain here. I'm going to turn this on, which is going to take a moment. So we're going to turn this on. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to calculate everything, and then we're going to set this to, you can see how much more complex this fire is. So let's then change this to the rendered view. And there you have it. So that took a little bit of time for it to render completely, but you can see that with the added detail, you'd have to do some adjustments here, but you do get some really interesting weird effects when you start to really play with a lot of these different values. Now, in efforts to keep this a little bit more simple on our processing and everything like that, we're just going to use this right here. So let's put that in there. And let's just take a look at what this looks like with the smoke turned back on to a scattering scale of 1 and go to the rendered view. And let's change this multiply because it's a little bit high. Maybe a 5 here. That looks okay. Maybe a 2.5. Let's try that. Maybe a 3.5. So that looks okay. Maybe a little bit more volume in our smoke here because I really like it when it looks really nice and thick. So maybe something like that. You can see there that with this effect here and this multiply that it might be a little bit too much is being removed from our fireball here for it really to make sense. So let's change this to a 10 and let's increase the overall scattering scale by a 10, maybe a 20. You can you can see there that we can start to have some really cool effects. Now, like I keep saying, once you add back in your detail with the noise, it's going to really slow things down. So let's go back to solid mode. I'm going to save. I'm going to turn on noise, and let's see what this looks like when we change the detail level. So if we zoom in a bit, you can see that now we have a super detailed fireball that is currently rendering. And you can see here that this does take a little bit longer with this higher detailed rendering. It does take quite a bit longer than Cycles or maybe another rendering program to really view your fire simulation. Part of it has to do with the detail level of the noise that I have here. So you might have a little bit easier time, but I would recommend you do most of your shading with the noise turned off and then add the noise at the end, make some adjustments to your project, and then from there, you can get your final rendering completed and done. So let's give this a minute to come back on. It probably because I resized this viewport, it is taking a little bit of time. So let's just give it a moment to come back and then we can start again. Now from this point here, you can basically take your, I'm just going to change this up here to the 3D viewport. What you could do is you could basically select your lights here and you can change the coloring of your fire and smoke by changing your lights on either side. You can change this to a, let's say, a red color. It might take a minute here to update. You can see there we have a red color now in the background and a blue color in the front. So you can change your smoke that way. Or if you have your domain selected and you go into your volume material, and let's make this a little bit easier to see here. If you go in here, you can change the overall color of your smoke by changing this absorption here. And you can change your fire by changing these colors here, which I'm not going to do right now, but you can do this to make your simulation look unique and different according to what you'd like it to see or what you would like it to look like. And then here you can change your multiply here and you can change your settings up here. What you could also do for your absorption, and I'm not going to do that for this tutorial. I might do another one later for like even more advanced, things you can do. But what you can do is you can take this color ramp and you can duplicate it or just add a new one and pipe this into a color ramp and then put that into your absorption color right here and adjust those settings and you'll get a varied color look to all of your smoke. And you can do the same thing like we did here. You can use some different multiply and math nodes to create a unique coloring for your smoke effect. And again, I recommend turning noise off for your simulations while you do this so you could just get some general stuff and then you can adjust it here. Because as you'll find out when you really start doing this, depending on the complexity of your volume, this might get a little bit tricky when it comes to changing some of these values and seeing immediate results. It might take some time to update your viewport. For the last sort of thing here, let's turn back on multi-scattering. So I'm going to save. I'm going to turn this onto solid mode just to reset everything. Change this to multi-scattering, and then let's go ahead and take a look at the rendered view here. And there we are. We now have the multi-scattering and it's been turned on now, so you can see that we have some pretty cool effect here. You can see that there's a lot more brightness going on, a lot more lights are being, pushed around inside of the volume material and you get some really cool stuff going on. Now, the last thing I'm going to do, we're not going to do a full render of this because it's really not necessary. I'm going to let's pull this over here. Let's turn noise off because everything just gets really slowed down once we have that set there. Let's pull this over and let's just pull over this right here. So what I will recommend that you do, if you go to your render properties here, You need to make sure that your light paths have at least somewhere around 5 or 6. If it's too low, everything's going to look very dark. So for example here, let's just push this over. We're just going to take a look at this in this lower resolution sort of view here. If you change this to like a 2, for example, you can see that there's barely anything visible because it's only 2 bounces and all that you're seeing is just some of that being rendered here. And if we change this to a 4, for example, you can see that we're getting more, but it's not quite there yet. We don't have quite enough bounces to really make this look decent. And this all depends on what you're trying to do, but I do recommend going at least to something like a 5 or a 6 to get a decent one, at least a decent render. So you can see there that we have more definition happening, and the higher you go, the better it's going to be. Now, with the light tracing, something like this, since there is no refraction happening with lights that really, has cast light or anything, you really don't need the light tracing turned on. So don't turn that on. It's just going to slow everything down. You can turn on clamping, which you can set this to a 10, which will make it equal to your, blender and all that. For I think they still use this clamping setting on their standard. They might have changed it, but it will increase the speed at which it's rendering, but it will remove some of the brightness in the brighter parts of your overall rendering. So just keep that in mind. And you'll want to maybe use the denoiser. It's really up to you on if you want to use a denoiser or not for these sorts of things. I usually don't because it tends to lose some of the definition. And for the samples, uh, on your final, use cache friendly. If you need to use out of core because you have something that has more RAM needed than your GPU can handle, you can turn on out of core, which will use your CPU. Turn on your adaptive sampling and set this to something that's going to work for you. I would do some test samples in some areas. And then you can turn on the pixel filtering, which helps to kind of take out some of the weird sort of super tiny pixels that happen. So this kind of filters that out and allows you to sort of blend those together to make it a little bit more of a refined looking image. But turning that off is fine as well if you want some super detail there. And as always, my recommendation is that in your render properties, whenever you set up your camera, change this to a 200%, in my opinion. Change it to 200% of whatever your final needs to be, because you'll get a lot more crisp of an image, because in post you can take that image, scale it down to whatever your final resolution needs to be, and it'll look a lot tighter and a lot neater, even if you use less samples in your overall render. So that's definitely a step that I would recommend. If you can't handle 200%, change it to a 150 and you'll be good as well. So that's going to be it for this tutorial. Hopefully you learned something, and by the end you can get a decent render coming out of this. Thanks very much to my patrons. If you'd like to become a patron, you can click the link down below in the video description and see all the benefits you can get there. And I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.